Hello, my name is Isabella.
And I'm Julia.
And today we will be presenting clothing during the Middle Ages. The history of clothes in the Middle Ages is an overview of the fashion throughout the years in this era and the sumptuary laws that distinguished 7 social categories and made each of them very different from one another.
Clothing in the Middle Ages was indicated by the pyramid of power, just like everything else in feudalism.
You are born into a class of people and usually stayed in that class for your entire life. Your clothing, food, marriages, and homes were already determined for you depending on your social class.
The laws of clothing were very strict, and everyone had to follow them very carefully, since these indicated a person's social class.
Clothing in Europe. No matter the country, there was always one common standard for fashion and clothing, but it could vary depending on the customs of the country and the peculiarities of each race.
For example, in Italy, the clothing always maintained a certain factor of grandeur, even if the influence of antiquity wasn't quite lost.
And in Germany and Switzerland, their clothes had a massive and heavy appearance because the clothes in the medieval ages were highly influenced by the kings and queens of the era.
Now, what were the sumptuary laws?
The sumptuary laws were a series of laws that consisted of very strict rules imposed by rulers on what people could wear regardless of their wealth. They served to control behavior and ensure that a specific class structure was maintained.
The word sumptuary is derived from a Latin word meaning expenditure, and they apply to food, furniture, and clothing.
These laws were based around the idea that only the wealthy could wear fashionable clothes.
These laws were known by all the English people and were passed by the medieval kings of England.
If you didn't follow the laws, there would be harsh punishments such as fines, loss of property or titles, and even death.
Rulers were very strict with this because it was the way they told people from different social classes apart.
The first English sumptuary law were passed in the year 1281 in the city of London, which was influenced by the European country and were updated every now and then.
The English Sumptuary Law of 1363 was a sumptuary legislation passed that included specific restrictions for women according to the social classes or positions of their fathers and husbands.
English Sumptuary Law of 1363 in different social classes. The wives and daughters of servants were not to wear veils above 12 pence in value. They wore wimples to cover their hair. A wimple was a piece of material, square or circular in shape, and was strapped over the head to the shoulders and held in place by a band around the brow. The wimple completely covered the hair, neck, and ears of medieval women.
Handicraftsmen and yeomen's wives were not to wear silk veils, and the wives and daughters of laborers were not to wear clothes beyond a certain price or a girdle garnished with silver. The simple dresses from the Middle Ages consisted of a dress of cheap woolen cloth fastened by a belt or a girdle around the waist, and a sleeveless tunic. Shoes were made out of leather and simply wrapped around the foot.
The use of fur was confined to the ladies of knights, with a rental above 200 marks a year. The wives and daughters of knights were not to wear cloth of gold, velvet, satin, or ermine.
Cloth of gold and purple silk were confined to women of the royal family.
Another significant change that came up with this legislation was the ban of importation of silk and lace by Lombards and other foreigners. In general, the feudalistic social class pyramid went a little bit like this.
We're starting at the lowest rank, the peasants. They were like slaves, or better known as the serfs of the feudalistic system. Their clothes were meant to be cheap, basic, and practical, so they consisted of
a blouse of cloth fastened by a leather belt around the waist, a mantle made of thick woolen material which fell from his shoulders to halfway down the legs or chest, short woolen trousers or a skirt and shoes or large boots. From the belt hung a sheath for his knife or her purse. In cold weather they wore a woolen hat made of coarse woolen cloth. Gloves were only worn for their practical clothing value and were padded for use in tasks such as hedging.
Then came the religious people.
Each medieval nun had 2 habits, 2 wimples and veils, a scapular for work, shoes, and stockings. The earliest Benedictine nuns wore clothing consisting of white, gray, brown, or black wool, depending on the strictness of the order and what they proclaimed.
The traditional clothes of the medieval nuns consisted of a nun's habit, tied around the waist with a cloth or a leather belt. The scapula, a garment consisting of a long white piece of woolen cloth worn over the shoulders with an opening for the head and a veil attached to it. Some nuns would wear a cross upon a chain around their necks. A nun's hair was roughly short and hidden from view at all times. and the second habit was for nighttime purposes only.
The earliest Benedictine monks wore clothing consisting of white or gray habits, which eventually became black, hence the term black monks. The Cistercian and Carthusian orders of medieval monks adhered to 7 stricter rules than the Benedictines wore undyed wool for their monks' clothes to proclaim their poverty, and they were referred to as the white monks.
Going higher in the pyramid came the knights. A medieval knight's clothing assured protection and comfort to them.
It consisted of underclothes of linen woolen stockings covering their legs, a padded garment known as acton, arming coat, doublet, garbanson, and hacketon, which consisted of a quilted coat which was either sewn or stuffed with linen or even grass that served as padding for additional armor worn over the top.
The parts of a knight's armor were a complex series of garments, chainmails, and iron plates that covered the most vulnerable parts of their bodies.
Over the armor, they wore a surcoat, which was a robe with a belt around the waist, inscribed with the coat of arms or device of the knight in order to identify the knight in battle.
Next in the pyramid came the medieval lord.
Their clothes were made of bright colors of silk, velvet, and damask to represent authority. Fur was used for linings or trimming, and linen for undergarments, which were covered by a gown. Women also wore gemstone accessories since the stone cutting had not been invented. Rings and pins were the most popular items.
Those were a status symbol, and to maintain authority, laws were passed that forbade peasants from wearing fancy clothes, which they couldn't afford anyway.
Next in the pyramid came the monarchy.
Western European kings admired the splendor of the Byzantine Empire's clothing and copied many of its styles. Long undertunics made of silk and embroidered with gold thread were commonly worn by medieval kings. The color purple was usually reserved for the clothing of kings and queens because it was a sign of prestige at the time. Long white T-shaped tunics were often worn by medieval kings at coronations and important events where it was important to impress guests.
Originally, their shoes were also made of relatively poor quality leathers. However, the trend changed during the Middle and Late Medieval Ages, and rich use of silk and fur shoes became common.
Queens wore robes that were made out of the finest furs and most splendid clothes. Clothing for royalty and noble women consisted of many layers. Their undergarments were made up of hose and chemise and covered by an underskirt of linen or silk. On top of the skirt was a long gown that flowed from behind and was covered by a luxurious tunic. Special castle shoes were worn for the inside of the castle, and a second set of wood and leather shoes slipped over the castle shoes for the outdoors.
The royalty adorned their clothes with embroidered lace and gems to add more luxury to their wardrobe. Fur trimmed the mantles of the dresses as well as the cuffs for men.
Fabrics for royalty, such as velvet and silk, were usually imported, and only royalty were allowed to wear gold and purple silk. The Crusades had a tremendous impact on fashion due to the many exotic fabrics brought to Europe, such as satin.
The medieval women's clothing of early Middle Ages was still influenced by the classical styles of Greek and Roman women. However, during later medieval times, medieval women's clothing underwent several changes, and tighter-fitting garments with low necklines became more popular. Clothing components such as corsets, swordcoat, and gown became increasingly common form of clothing during this time onwards.
Hairstyles in the medieval ages.
Their hairstyles changed a lot throughout time. They wore high headdresses, long braids, buns, covered the hair, had it loose, and others throughout time.
They also wore tight lacings to make themselves thinner with better posture, and for makeup it consisted of a white lead powder which they put on their faces and perfumes from the east. Medieval hairstyles were highly formal with splendid headwear and a rich variety of styles. Among the upper classes, braids and buns were very popular, and it was also common to use metallic wires and ribbons for making intricate medieval hairstyles. Sometimes, bands of flowers and leaves were used along with silk ribbons. The variety of women's medieval hairstyles was greater than men's for obvious reasons.
Women mostly had long hair, which they arranged in various medieval hairstyles. There was rarely a trend of short or medium hairstyle length. Long hair provided the opportunity to arrange medieval women's hair into different styles. During the late Middle Ages, coiled buns were introduced, which were used on each side of the head. During the same time, it was not very uncommon to display hair parted from the middle while hiding the remaining hair with a bonnet.
A man's shaved head was considered one of the highest forms of humility. Due to the same reason, monks shaved their head from the middle while leaving a narrow strip around it. A common medieval men's hairstyle was short hair combed toward the front on the forehead without parting them. For men, particularly among the nobility, the most common practice was to let hair grow long and sometimes part it from the middle.